Americans going to the pictures on a weekend in 1970 would no longer see marquees with Pillow Talk and My Fair Lady written on them, but The Landlord and Five Easy Pieces instead. Unlike Pillow Talk and My Fair Lady, in which American audiences would splendor in the picture's utopias and fantasy worlds, movies like The Landlord and Five Easy Pieces would wake audiences up due to their themes of equality and borderline nihilism, respectively, reflecting a gritty realism that Pillow Talk and My Fair Lady was never allowed to reflect under the production code of old Hollywood. Hal Ashby's The Landlord and Bob Rafelson's Five Easy Pieces were films that came from the watershed of the Hollywood Renaissance, a period of Hollywood filmmaking from the late 60s to the late 70s, or arguably to the early 80s, that gave creative control to the director as opposed to the producer. The Renaissance, influenced by foreign art films and classical Hollywood cinema, was a period of great artistic achievement based on new freedom and widespread experimentation, bringing pictures that challenged the political, social, and cultural views of the time with new narrative and stylistic conventions. The counterculture film and the genre revisionist picture were two prominent types of movies during the Renaissance, such as Hal Ashby's Harold and Maude and Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde, respectively. The narrative and stylistic conventions of classical Hollywood were relatively inviolate in order not to risk box office losses, with exceptions of course. Its pictures, to an extent, possessed linear narratives and extreme censorship brought upon them by the dreaded and absurd production code of 1930, drastically censoring sex, violence, and all forms of dissolute behavior, letting no crime go unpunished. Stylistically, classical Hollywood followed continuity editing, being the maintenance of a continuous story, not having its illusion broken by distinct cutting, and additionally, stars were a must to sell the picture. Harold and Maude's narrative revolves around a controversial romance, violent black comedy, and anti-establishment and counterculture themes. Stylistically, the film has a full, non-diegetic soundtrack of songs, and furthermore, the film is a counterculture picture, thus rebelling against everything that's unfair and old, including classical Hollywood style. Therefore, Ashby's Harold and Maude constitutes a complete break from the narrative and stylistic conventions of classical Hollywood. However, unlike the countercultural Harold and Maude, Warren Beatty's Passion Project is both different and similar to classical Hollywood. Bonnie and Clyde is narratively different by its controversial tonal shifts, rebelling against Hollywood's narrative cliches, and by its extreme, for the time, violence, and stylistically different due to its rebellion against continuity, using fast cutting and slow motion. However, due to being an homage to Warner Bros.' 1930s classical gangster films, the film is also similar to classical Hollywood, having a linear narrative and the criminals punished at the end. Starting off this analysis with Hal Ashby's Harold and Maude, although being a critical and commercial failure, the film gave Ashby's contemporaries hope that films like this can be made. To understand what this refers to, one must split Harold and Maude's unique aesthetic into two parts, the first being the film's eccentric narrative and stylistic conventions. Thomas L. Sesser states that unlike classical Hollywood, many new Hollywood films have characters whose ideas of happiness and freedom implies emotional bonds that are lived outside the nuclear family. Elsasser's statement is accurate to Harold and Maude, as in the joking synopsis of the film's producer, Charles Mulville, the film's plot revolves around a boy screwing his grandmother. This bizarre and controversial plot is the film's first narrative difference from old classical Hollywood narrative. During post-production of Billy Wilder's Love in the Afternoon, Allied artists would not release the picture since it ended with lovers Audrey Hepburn and Gary Cooper running away together with no sign of wedlock to come. Wilder thus had to dub in Maurice Chevalier's voice, saying that they were soon married. This incongruity, still dominant in 1957, was the influence of the production code that rid all classical Hollywood pictures of immorality. Thus, a plot so sexually taboo as Harold and Maude's romantic relationship between a boy and a 79-year-old lady, including copulation in the narrative, would have never been allowed during the censor-dominated classical Hollywood era. New wave Hollywood films grew increasingly more anxious, alienated, and nihilistic. In Harold and Maude, this is evident as before Harold meets Maude and realizes how to live, he was in fact utterly anxious, alienated, and on the border of nihilism due to his mother's repressed traditions forced upon him. This morbid narrative represents a clear break from classical Hollywood narrative, in which productions were controlled by studios and a depressing narrative would surely lose them money. On top of possessing these pessimistic new Hollywood narrative characteristics, Harold and Maude expressed them through black comedy, a style too remote and hazardous for the Hays office. When one thinks of black comedy in classical Hollywood, truly only Preston Sturges and Frank Capra come to mind, at least for me. The narrative technique of black comedy is truly a break from classical Hollywood, and Harold and Maude's use of abundant black humor, such as Vietnam jokes, Harold setting fire to himself, whimsically deciding to chop off his fake hand, the blasphemous painting of the Holy Mary, and comically disrespecting funeral ceremonies, all demonstrate the film's break from classical Hollywood narrative style. Although Harold and Maude is not distinctly violent, the film does show violence both comically, with Harold randomly cutting off his hand, keeping a straight face, and explicitly, with Harold burning himself, hanging himself, and performing harakiri on himself, with a little blood appearing, which would not be allowed in classical Hollywood as according to the production code, brutal violence must not be presented in detail. When someone got shot or killed in a classical Hollywood film, you would rarely see a bullet hit the body in the same shot with the shooter, but instead cut to the shot after, to the reaction of pain. A distinctive narrative difference in Harold and Maude is the counterculture themes in its plot, such as ridiculing America's involvement in the Vietnam War, going against the government and authority, and promoting the sense of leftist hippie freedom. Counterculture refers to a way of life and set of attitudes opposed to the prevailing social norm. While classical Hollywood supported the political values of America in its pictures such as disproving Senate corruption and revering the presidency of Abraham Lincoln in Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, New Hollywood challenged them. Unlike during the classical Hollywood days, Hollywood studios in the late 60s and in the 70s would give creative control to directors whose original work was popular with contemporary audiences, as their films dealt with the issues of the time, and the studios would ultimately profit from their pictures. Hollywood in the early 60s, hindered by the code, would not give justice to the rising social and political changes of the times, and instead lingered in their utopian realms of censorship, thus gradually losing their audiences, being one of the reasons towards the downfall of the out-of-date production code. Hal Ashby supported the counterculture movement. Harold and Maude's writer, Colin Higgins, as well as its director, Ashby, were against the living room war, ultimately ridiculing its hypocrisy, being a narrative convention completely different from classical Hollywood, an issue that was popular with contemporary audiences. Harold and Maude's anti-government narrative can be summarized by the argument of Thomas Alcesser. Alcesser introduces the countercultural crossover in which the law and the outlaw change place. This theme is true to Ashby's film, as when Harold finds his path with Maude, they begin to live free, live every day to the fullest, and also steal cars and run away from the authorities. Although these actions are against the law, in Harold and Maude they are part of the lovers' philosophy of freedom. Thus the audience, relating to the couple, justified their wrong actions in the context of this narrative, which supports Alcesser's argument of new Hollywood films having a notable bias for the underdog, the outsider, and the outlaw. Although akin to classical Hollywood narrative in the fact that the lover's actions are, in a way, punished at the end, with Harold ultimately losing Maude, but there is also an ambiguous scene of getting away with it, being a clear break from classical narrative, as Harold ultimately leaves the morbid final scene, skipping and playing his ukulele, showing the audience that he has decided to live on, and like his deceased lover, will continue to live free, and will continue to break the law. This divergence from classical Hollywood narrative, in terms of the freedom theme, is not only expressed in the film's narrative, through supporting the attractive outlaws, but also through the film's style. Old Hollywood never incorporated non-diegetic songs into their soundtrack, meaning if a song was heard, there would always be someone shown on the screen singing it. However, demonstrating a clear break from classical style. New Hollywood films such as The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, and of course Harold and Maude all possessed soundtracks full of non-diegetic songs. Harold and Maude's soundtrack was produced by Cat Stevens, having written some original songs for the film, as well as using some existing ones. This non-diegetic soundtrack is the stylistic difference between Harold and Maude and classical Hollywood style. Cat Stevens' songs not only gave the film a fresh sound, but a fresh feel as well, as titles such as Don't Be Shy and If You Want to Sing Out, strengthened the entire freedom element of the film, making audiences understand, as the lyrics say, that they can do what they want, even so far as against the authorities, a controversial message that would never have been allowed in classical Hollywood style. The second part of Harold and Maude's aesthetic is its implicit rejection of old Hollywood through the symbolism of Harold's mother and Maude. Harold's mother, Mrs. Chasen, played by the classically trained actress Vivian Pickles, is a woman who identifies herself as an aristocrat defined by wealth, education, and alleged good manners, and wants her son Harold to follow in the same path. Maude, played by American actress Ruth Gordon, although of an aristocratic European background, represents the opposite, an anti-materialistic, anti-aristocratic rebel, living life freely and to the fullest. Not only does this represent the generation gap between the baby boomers and their parents, but more importantly, this difference between the two women is the difference between old and new Hollywood. Classical Hollywood, like Mrs. Chasen, was repressed and went by many strict rules burdened upon it by the production code. Old Hollywood moguls, such as Jack Warner, head of Warner Brothers until 1969, were extremely wealthy, like Harold's mother, and were experts at knowing what kind of picture brought them big money, thus were reluctant to accept change such as new kinds of pictures, or symbolically, to accept Maude. This is evident in the film, as Harold's mother is unwilling to accept Harold's borderline nihilism, lack of interest in marriage, settling down, morbid interests, and especially his decision to marry a grandmother. Because these are things that Harold's mother did not engage in herself. In fact, the entire idea of the rebellious nature of new Hollywood films going against the system of classical Hollywood, such as Bob Rafelson's complete destruction of classical narrative structure in Head, or Woody Allen's similar treatment of classical style in Annie Hall, is clearly represented by Harold himself, who rebels against his mother's aristocratic wishes for him by purposefully hurting her by continually pretending to commit suicide. Supporting this idea of contrast between mother and son, in the first act of the picture, we get a shot of Mrs. Chasen turning on the radio, which starts playing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1, and then her getting into her enormous swimming pool, relishing in her domestic opulence. Then we dolly out to reveal Harold floating as if dead in the corner of the pool. Mrs. Chasen rolls her eyes and continues swimming. Having Mrs. Chasen turn on the radio herself, starting the powerful classical composition, and Hal Ashby residing on the long shot of Mrs. Chasen getting into the pool, links music to character, expressing Mrs. Chasen's aristocratic, wealthy, and classical ways, contrasting her way of life to that of the suicidal, morbid Harold, purposefully rebelling against his mother, having the violent strikes of the concerto play exclusively during the two shots of Harold's underwater, arduous close-up. Although Hal Ashby's Harold and Maude demonstrates a clear break from classical Hollywood style, Arthur Penn's Bonnie and Clyde is both different and similar to old Hollywood style. The difference and similarity of Bonnie and Clyde to old Hollywood style rests in the film being a genre revisionist picture, a common new Hollywood practice of updating classical genres to new themes and with modern stylistic techniques, such as revisionist westerns. Thus, because of this style, Penn's film is both different from classical style due to it possessing new narrative and stylistic techniques, but also similar to classical Hollywood style because of also possessing some old techniques, keeping the roots of the genre it is revising intact. Penn's film is an homage to Hollywood gangster movies of the 1930s. Thus, narratively, the film is exactly like classical narrative in the sense of it being of linear structure, a story told without any shifts in time, going from point A to point B, with a climax and a resolution, and, like in 1930s gangster pictures, Penn's film punishes Bonnie and Clyde for their immoral actions in the end. Although Bonnie and Clyde possesses no note to the viewer of the studio's stance against crime, like 1930s gangster films did, it does, however, like classical Hollywood, but more impactfully, punish its outlaws at the end. Although death was in fact the real end of Bonnie and Clyde, the film's ending use of violence to emphasize the wrongfulness of the outlaws' actions is truly what makes the picture similar to classical Hollywood's production code anti-crime attitude. The distinct violent punishment by gunfire of Bonnie and Clyde echoes the censorship of the Hays Code, reminding viewers of James Cagney's painful electrical chair execution in Angels with Dirty Faces. Screenwriter Robert Towne, who was hired to fix the script, even moved the scene of Bonnie's blow of consciousness when Eugene reveals his occupation of undertaker to before the scene of Bonnie's reunion with her mother, in order for the reunion to be a bittersweet one instead of a happy one, reflecting a sense of her and Clyde's inevitable doom to come. However, due to being a picture of revisionist intent, the film inevitably brings forth new narrative and stylistic conventions. As Peter Biskind points out, Robert Towne purposefully rid the film's script of classical Hollywood narrative cliches, and included scenes like W.C. Moss foolishly deciding to park the getaway car and having trouble getting out after for the quick getaway, and Bonnie counting all of her change at a restaurant. The film also diverges from classical narrative in tone. Influenced by French New Wave's Jean-Luc Godard, Penn's film shifts from morbid scenes of bloody violence to a comic and upbeat tone supplied by the jocular bluegrass picking of Flatt and Scruggs during the chase scenes, as well as a humorous undertaker scene starring Gene Wilder. The explicit violence in Bonnie and Clyde demonstrates a clear break from the classical narrative, as, like described earlier with Harold and Maude, classical Hollywood's production code restricted the presentation of murder explicitly, whereas Warren Beatty and Arthur Penn's intent was to shock audiences by showing the gruesome act of killing itself, blood, bullets, and all, such as the close-up of a police officer getting shot in the face through a car window with no cuts, for audiences to witness and comprehend the true horrors of murder. Brutally murdering an authority figure through a car window is like brutally murdering the government, punishing it for its absurd involvement in the Vietnam War. The same goes for the violent finale, with cartridges being emptied into Bonnie and Clyde, instead of cutting to a single bullet hitting the body, making audiences physically sick and see and understand the true amount of punishment the outlaws deserve for their immoral actions. Stylistically, the film disregards the conventional establishing shots of classical style, and instead creates meaning through opening the film on an extreme close-up of Bonnie's face, representing the boldness of the film's style, as well as of Bonnie herself. The film dissolves to this close-up from a photograph of Clyde Barrow, ultimately linking the two characters' destinies, and the close-up of Bonnie specifically shows her mouth, introducing her sexuality, one that we quickly learn needs to be satisfied. The film also uses a technique relatively unused in classical Hollywood style, slow motion, inspired by the French New Wave, to effectively emphasize the punishment and gruesomeness of Bonnie and Clyde's gunfire deaths. Additionally, during the same scene, fast cutting is used between the close-ups of Clyde and Bonnie to emphasize the brevity of their final connection with each other before their deaths, as well as their realization of the inevitability of the situation. Bonnie and Clyde is also different from classical Hollywood style in the way of being, like Harold and Maude, a countercultural work, being a picture against the establishment. Bonnie and Clyde, until the finale, destroy the authority and become the authority figures themselves. Destroying the authority, according to Biskind, represents the film's destruction and screw you to Vietnam, to the repressed old American generation, and to the fading society of old Hollywood. Penn's film opened the movies for the young, having kids identify with the outlaws as the outlaws destroyed what the young generation did not have power to destroy themselves. Thus the film's rebellion against the old and unfair, and the audience's identification with the picture's villains, were things that classical narrative style did not possess. That same marquee that only yesterday read The Landlord and 5 Easy Pieces now reads The Last Picture Show and The Last Movie a year later. Bogdanovich's The Last Picture Show, though with some nuances, owes everything to John Ford, being the last classical American picture in a way. However, Dennis Hopper's The Last Movie is an unprecedented experimental meditation on Westerns, colonialism, and death. The difference between Bogdanovich's and Hopper's work towards classical Hollywood style is as close you can get to the difference between Bonnie and Clyde and Harold and Maude towards the same topic. Like the radically different The Last Movie, Harold and Maude also constitutes a complete break with the censored and law-abiding narratives of classical Hollywood, due to its controversial romantic plot, anti-authority and anti-Vietnam mood, and violent black comedy, as well as a break with classical Hollywood style, due to its non-diegetic, song-filled soundtrack. Whereas like Last Picture Show, Bonnie and Clyde is both different from classical Hollywood narrative and style due to its revisionist nature, possessing tonal shifts, rebellion against Hollywood's narrative cliches, and traditional continuity, as well as the use of slow motion and extreme violence, murdering America's old ideals and absurd politics. But also similar due to its homage to 1930s gangster pictures, having a linear narrative and a finale of punishing the criminals. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you like this video, then check out our other cinema documentaries and video essays, as well as our Have You Seen This Movie series for a spotlight on obscure, forgotten, or even sometimes popular movies. Also, don't forget to give us a like, and see you soon with another fascinating video.